Hi, my name's Tori and I wish I knew more about blood products.
Hi, my name's Letitia. I wish I knew more about taking care of myself when starting shift work.
Hi, my name is Lydia. I wish I would know more about how to work as in a team and solve conflict.
Hello, welcome to Five Things, the nursing podcast from the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. My name is Liz Crow.
I'm Jesse Spur, and this is a podcast by, for, and with the amazing nurses and health professionals in our corner of the world. We hope to connect with a global community as we move from surviving to thriving. Welcome to Five Things.
Hello, my name is Liz Crow.
And I'm Jesse Spur.
Welcome to another episode of Five Things Nursing. And today we're actually welcoming a dear friend of mine, Professor Gail Robinson, who has a joint appointment with the Queensland Brain Institute and the School of Psychology at the University of Queensland. And she is coming to speak to us today about memory. Welcome, Gail.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
We're glad to have you. And it's a really interesting topic that we haven't gone really near yet. So very excited. Can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up in this specialised area, your professional origin story, if you will?
Yes, well, I started as a clinical psychologist and clinical neuropsychologist. And why did I train in that? So it sort of goes back to when I was about 18 or 17. And I was always interested in people. But then I remember driving around with my then sort of boyfriend, and we drove around one of those roundabouts and he read the road sign and he read it wrong. Like I read it as like hail and he might have read it as Gale, and I thought, wait a minute, how is that happening? What is going on in the brain? So right from there, I got interested in reading and thinking about cognition. So cognition is just a fancy word for thinking skills. So I've always been interested in how do we get our thoughts together, how do we think of something to say, and what happens when it goes wrong particularly. So that was the dyslexia. And so I worked in hospitals. That's my first job, was in aged care and rehabilitation. And then I went to London for about 14 years. I worked in the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery as a clinical neuropsychologist. And while I was there, I was so interested in research and how things worked that I did my PhD, and I then came to Brisbane in Australia and the University of Queensland, and that's about 14 years ago now. So I'm a clinician still. I still see patients, but I primarily do research and trying to understand how is the mind organised? Like, where is memory? What is memory? How is language? How do we talk? So it's really anything to do with the brain and particularly thinking.
How fascinating. I was thinking on the way here, do you feel a lot of pressure to remember everything because memory is your specialty?
No, not at all.
You at the grocery store and if you forget something, do you just wing it? So
No, I'm really good at saying to people, oh, no, that's just normal, to forget one or two things. Don't worry about it. And I've always had a really good memory. So I was the person in the clinical department that when they talked about a patient, I could just rattle off their file number, or I knew exactly, what date they were coming. So I've always had a bit of a good memory. So perhaps that's part of the story for why I really like to think about memory.
Yeah. And it is interesting amongst humans just how different some people's capacity to remember certain things is.
Absolutely. I've got a niece and she can regurgitate conversations word for word. Like you have a conversation or she goes somewhere and the whole family says, Sophie, what happened? Can you just remind us? And, she did this from about 4 years old. And other people, of course, have a photographic memory. Yeah. They remember visual scenes very well.
So I can remember really pointless things extremely well. So I am like the memory keeper for our family and our friends, but also I can recite things word for word from Sesame Street. I'm the person who remembers lines from movies, but the periodic table, I got nothing.
No, and I think, Liz, that can partly be explained by interest.
Yeah. Right, so this is going to be a completely fascinating podcast, not just for our listeners, but for Jessie and I. So let's jump straight into it. Number one, What is memory?
Well, I put that as number one because memory is more than one thing. So a lot of people think memory is just a short-term memory where you've got to retain information over time. But in fact, what most people call short-term memory is technically long-term memory, meaning you learn something new and hold it for a long time. So that's our long-term memory, and that can be for basically personal, episodic information. And episodic is another technical word, but it's just things that happen in your autobiography, meaning it's personal to you. So your things that you did at a particular place and a particular time, that is an episode or an episodic memory, and that you can hold for a long time. That's what people really have, a collection of episodes that make up their long-term memory. And I can contrast that with short-term memory. For us, that's very much just a few seconds up to a minute. Short-term memory is where you have to rehearse information to keep it. So right now, or if I asked you what your phone number is, then you tell me the phone number. Well, I'd have to keep sort of rehearsing it in my mind or write it down. And that's your short-term memory. Now, if I was going to write it down or do something with it, like you go to the grocery store, you're trying to get your $50 out of your pocket, and then you're trying to figure out how much money you've got, so you've got to do some calculations. That's a little working memory. You've got to hold the information long enough to work out what the answer is. So that's, again, very short term. So the short term and working memories are very instantaneous in a way. And both of those things that I've been talking about, they're also what we can declare. So it's an explicit memory that we are aware of, and we can tell someone about that. So another type of memory that I can tell you about is my semantic memory.
So what is a semantic memory?
So the semantic memory is your general knowledge about the world. So that's your facts. So, for example, knowing what a table is, knowing that you can write on it like you're doing right now, and knowing things like what is London, knowing it's a big city across the other side of the world in England. That's a semantic fact. So it's our general knowledge about the world. Now, episodic memory, meaning the things that you know or you learn at a particular point in time, so you can be here right now and you're learning something about memory, I hope. So right now we're having an episode. But if you then learn about episodic memory several times, it won't be just about today. So that will, in a sense, transition and become a fact for you. So even at school, if you go back and think when you learnt something new, you were in the classroom, and if it was really fantastic, you might be like, oh, I remember my teacher when she said something specific. And then later on, you just know that information. So it's, you might have heard it in several different settings, and then it becomes knowledge and becomes sort of a more semantic. So all of that is still explicit, and what we call that declarative. I can tell you what I know.
Yeah.
I can tell you about my memory. I can tell you about the table. But if, we don't know, and people call it more of a procedural or implicit memory, like learning to ride a bike. So you get a motor skill, like you get competent at something, like riding a bike, and then at first it's really effortful, like you have to balance, and then you have to steer, and then you've got to lift your feet off. So at first you're sort of instructing yourself how to do it. But once you know how to ride a bike, you just get on and ride.
Yeah.
So, and if I ask someone who's a really good bike rider now, how do you ride a bike? They would have trouble explaining it to me. So that's a learning. So there's a different type of memory is what I'm saying. So I guess fundamentally when people think about memory in the public, we all sort of talk about that episodic long-term memory. That's what most of us mean.
Yeah, so on the whole, most of us talk about short and long-term memory, but it's so much more complicated than that.
It sure is.
And a number of systems around that.
That's right. So these are memory systems, and they are different systems because in the brain, there are different parts of the brain that support the different systems. So it's not that they all have one memory center in the brain and it's all the same thing. No, the short-term memory and the long-term memory are supported by different parts of the brain. So if we get into the temporal lobe, for example, the middle of the brain, right sort of between the ears, there is something called the hippocampi. The hippocampus is, sort of looks like a seahorse. So if you imagine you have two little seahorses in your brain, well, that's really crucial for your personal autobiographical memories, the episodic memory. Without that hippocampus, it's hard to get the memories in and out.
Okay. And so can you explain to us how, at what point do you start to have a memory? Because, when you ask people what is your first memory, that is so varied. I have a brother who I swear doesn't remember anything before he was 10. He just, nothing, no trauma, just literally we call him a coma head, he just doesn't remember things. Whereas I clearly have a memory from when I'm about 2 years old. I was in hospital. It was a traumatic memory, being held down. I was in there for a couple of weeks. And yes. I absolutely have a memory of them pulling that curtain and wrapping me in a sheet to get more tests. So why is it that some people can remember things from a long time ago and some people don't?
Well, it actually leads me to my point too, which is about the emotion. For you, the trauma with the emotion actually helps to, in a sense, heighten and intensify that memory. So that's partly, there's a couple of things here. One is individual differences.
Yep.
I don't know about your brother, but perhaps memory's just not his strength. He might have other strengths, Liz. And for all of us, these things can vary a little bit. So, a lot of people say around 5, when the brain develops, you don't have cognitive skills. So sometimes we can also think there could be a sensory experience. There may be a memory, but there may also not be language or other cognitive abilities, the thinking skills, to support the encoding of the information to actually translate into the memory. So that is going to harness at different points for different people depending on the strengths and, individual. If you think about kids and physical development, some get coordinated early, others don't. So it's a little bit the same for cognition. Some skills kick in, but it's not like memory comes in at 2 for everybody. It's really not like that. It's partly dependent on experience, exposure, and genes. So nature, nurture also is relevant here.
Yeah. So I was just looking at some footage the other day of my boys when they were babies, and clearly from only a few months they recognise people. Is that different to memory?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, recognise in what sense? So you get the smile.
Yes.
So there is a part memory there, and that's that sensory, or there's some familiarity. Is that an implicit? So the mum smiles at the baby, there's a reflex, but obviously there's a recognition that something's familiar, but is that a memory?
Yeah.
It may not have all the other bits of information, like that's my mother, she looks like this, she's this.
Yeah, right.
She's a podcaster. So it doesn't have a rich representation, but it may have a sensory impression that has a familiarity.
Right. Which is interesting because we just did a podcast recently on dementia and what Charlene was making the point that, lots of people get very distressed during dementia if people don't recognise them, but familiarity can still be a very powerful connection, which is exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly. And that's why with memory, sometimes we talk about, can somebody recall a memory fully, freely and fully? So I do that myself. Or recollection or familiarity, sometimes that's enough to make a match. So if I was presented with, is it this, is it that? I'd be like, oh yeah, that's it. So I think we've all had that experience where you can't quite recall something and then you see something or you see a couple of things, you're like, oh no, that was it. So that is like a familiarity match as opposed to just freely recalling the whole event or episode.
And so you're saying that memory as a proper definition of it, that's got all the coding and systems around it, is probably around 5. Is that what you said? 5 years of age that it really?
No, I think I won't hang my hat on an actual number, but I think a lot of people around by 5 they have some sort of memory. So 10 is sort of late, I would say.
He's an intelligent guy. Something must be getting caught in that brain of his.
But it's also strengths and weaknesses. You know, those people who just retain all the semantic facts. You know, they know the politics, they know conversation, they have really strange knowledge about all sorts of things. Perhaps trivia, it might be what you were referring to at the beginning, actually, Liz. But other people, they remember the richness of personal encounters with family, the family holiday. When we think back to childhood, you know, if you just think back, can you think of the name of your school?
Yes.
And then can you think of an episode or something that happened at the school?
Yes.
So that can be different for people. So some people are really strong on the semantic part, like getting the name of the school, the address, but sometimes people have difficulty thinking of an actual episode or something that happened in that environment. So, you know, again, that's that individual strengths and weaknesses.
That's so fascinating.
Well, that's cognition. Cognition is fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's how they come together that makes a person unique.
That's amazing. All right. So let's go properly into your number 2, and that is, let's talk about memory and emotion and how those two things are connected.
So I think the memory and emotion, we've already hinted at the fact that the emotion, it basically heightens or intensifies the memory. It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative or happy or sad or shocking. Like trauma is one, you know, way of saying that emotion of the trauma can intensify the memory, and partly it's because of the pathways. So I talked about the little seahorse, the hippocampus, but there's also the amygdala and the emotional part of the brain. When that gets engaged, it's almost like alerting the sensory system to receive information. So it's almost like a get ready or here, this is important. So the whole brain, in a sense, lights up to receive that information. So the memory can be a little bit stronger for those things. Now, I want to say that that's not the same as what we call flashbulb memories. So do you know where you were when Princess Diana died?
I actually do.
Me too. Okay. So that's a flashbulb memory. I was actually in London at the time, and I do remember, you know, I think it was a Sunday morning, and I was at my house, and I still remember hearing the news, and it was just that disbelief. And I think everybody had that disbelief at first. But that is such a strong, it doesn't make sense, it's surreal. Is that possible? And I think for everybody, you can think about it. The same thing for 9/11.
Yeah.
I know exactly where I was when I saw those towers get hit. And so those things are what we call the flashbulb moments. And as a collective, we almost reinforce those memories because we all have the same video that we watch probably as well.
There's an awesome series of podcasts that Malcolm Gladwell did on revisionist history about flash memories and the study of those, and actually the discrepancy between our certainty of those memories and actually how accurate our memories are of those things as well. So we're very, very, very certain that we knew exactly where it was, but when they've done those longitudinal studies, the recollection with great certainty didn't really match actually where they were at the time of it happening when they write down really close proximity to it. So it's really interesting, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, no, that's really interesting because if you know, only recently we talk about recollection and you almost constitute a memory. You almost reconstruct it by bringing it up. So if I bring up a memory like I just did for now, or we can talk about your 2-year-old memory, you know, when you bring that up, we're now in this context environment. You're here with me, and you know, this is going to actually change the memory. So by bringing it up and talking about it, it gets new information added. So that reconstruction means that memory isn't accurate, and there's a whole area of eyewitness testimony, and they have shown that is. And I think it's even more so when you have emotion. You know, when you get the emotion, it's the sensory system is very switched on, very engaged, just because you've got that arousal, which is physical, and that's different from receiving information without that emotional state. So memories are plastic in some sense.
Yeah. And, that reminds me, sometimes I have to say to my boys, I'm not sure that's a memory or that's photos, video and a story. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think they actually remember it. It's because they've got
seen
video
the
of it.
Yep.
They've got photos of it,
Yes.
and it's like a family legendary story. And so in their minds, they think they have a memory about it, which I actually don't think they do.
Absolutely. And that's possible because you've talked about it, you've watched the video or you've looked at the photos, they've heard the stories, but they are in a sense are reconstructing or constructing perhaps for them a new memory. So that's did they, really know about that because they were there?
Yeah.
Or is it just because it's become the family legend and you've revisited it so many times?
I guess that's a real difference between, memory and truth or fact, isn't it?
Well, it can be.
It can be.
It can be. And so how do you establish whether it's really a memory or not? And I think, at the end of the day, when it's something internal to you, there's no way to verify. So I've studied someone with a highly superior autobiographical memory, super memory. It's the super memory case. And it's great fun, but we had to try and think, how do we create experiments that we can actually verify?
Yeah, fact
So
check.
we actually did some experiments more on semantic memory and looked at the contribution of that because you can't really verify, and that's the nature of memory. So in my profession, everybody gives memory tests and, they're fantastic and they help us see when people have new learning capacity or if they don't, but they're not fail-proof.
Yeah. So my husband and I did listen to the Malcolm Gladwell series on, the problems with witness, testimony, etc. And so we just listened to it, and we witnessed a car accident where someone backed into someone's car and they took off. I've told this story before on here, but they took off. And so we just listened to this thing. So you would think our memory was particularly acute. So we're like, I said, okay, I'm going to take photos and then we're going to come back and actually knock on the door because it was really early in the morning and tell someone, and remember. But I'd taken a photo. Anyway, so then we walked for maybe 40 minutes and the whole way, I'm thinking in my head like silver car, like trying to reinforce the memory. We came back and before we knocked on the door, I was like, okay, what do we actually know? And Nick's like, car colour. And I'm like, yes. And he's like, black. And I'm like, silver.
Oh,
and he's like, no, black. And I said, silver. And he said, it was this brand of car. And I was like, I thought it was this brand of car. And then we just both described the man who'd done it because he got out of the car and Nick's like he had a hat on and I was like, he was bald. There was no hat. Like it had only been 40 minutes. We had deliberately been trying
to remember.
We looked at the photo and the reality is that Nick remembered everything about the car absolutely correct because he's really interested in cars.
Yes.
I remembered everything about the man completely correct. I got part of the license plate right. He got all the license plate right. Yep. But if we hadn't had that photo, both of us would have taken the stand with absolute so convinced that we were right. And together we were sort of right, but separately we had big parts of the story completely incorrect.
So you can see how arguments happen between couples
I
and
was
family
thinking
breakdown exactly because of this, because people get entrenched and so sure about their memories. So we start to measure confidence in what your judgment is. And, that's also very interesting, just a variation. Some people are absolutely confident that they know and remember, and it's true. And that is the cause of, I think, quite a few bust-ups.
So you can feel that certainty and people use it for decision making, but it's a real I guess what you're saying is just pause, particularly if you're having a fight with your partner or someone in the family, that feeling of certainty is actually a feeling. It's not a fact.
It's not a fact, but it may be true, but it may not. Equally, that's true.
Yeah.
It's so easy to end up blurring into philosophy here, isn't it?
It is. It's like this is not what I thought we were talking about.
Yeah.
We'll try and keep a fence
But I
around
remember
it.
when I used to do couple counselling, I used to say to people, I hear that is your truth, but it doesn't mean it's the truth.
Absolutely. I think that's a good thing to do, and partly when you understand about the memory, because, by having your own personal recollection, even if, I'm sitting on the beach, suddenly what maybe didn't feel so great might feel better when I'm thinking about it because I'm in a lovely environment on the beach.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by the current situation that you're in or the room that you're in or where you are, that can influence the memories when you bring them up. So it's fascinating, and that relates to brain plasticity as well, of course.
All right, so your number 3 is you're going to talk to us about memory and brain injury. And obviously we work in a big acute hospital where we unfortunately see people have brain injuries either due to illness or injury or trauma. How is your memory impacted by a brain injury?
So it does depend a little bit on the type of brain injury, but maybe if I just talk first about the traumatic brain injury. So when that happens, there's a sudden loss of consciousness. Now, it may just be momentarily, or you may be in a coma for weeks. So that doesn't matter. But after that period of coma, you come out of that, you emerge into a state of post-traumatic amnesia. And what that means is your memories are patchy. You're unable to lay down new memories and keep them to have them later. But occasionally you might retain one or two things. So there might be an island of memory, but there's no consistent memory, from day to day. So that period of what we call PTA or post-traumatic amnesia can last, again, just a few seconds for some people when it's very minor, mild, it's a knock on the head and they're fine in an hour. But for some people, and I had a lady, Sheena, and we ended up writing a book about this experience because she had about 6 weeks where she had PTA, so she really wasn't recalling. In fact, she doesn't remember meeting me on the first occasion. Her husband told her about that. And then I met with her about 6 months later, and she was still just then, at that point, her memory was starting to be solid. So she had about 6 months of wondering, who am I? And later on, she still wonders whether she's the same person without those memories.
Yeah.
So again, that's that temporary stage of PTA. And some people get left with long-term problems with long-term memory. So being able to retain information consistently, it might be instead of 100%, what your memory was before, it may be that it's only like 80% or it's not quite reliable. And that really has a big impact on life if you're not really encoding and retaining new information. And that happens very commonly with the traumatic brain injuries, and part of it is because the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes, so these are parts of the brain, particularly around the base of the skull, so behind the eyes, often people might knock their heads, it's just the nature of the injury means that the memory part is actually quite vulnerable to trauma, particularly around the head injuries or the brain injuries. The other type of brain injury, I guess really we can talk about is things like stroke or when you have an illness affecting, so meningitis. Any of those things that happen in the brain can affect the memory. And primarily it's the long-term episodes, for your personal autobiographical memories, like what did you do? So it's being able to keep a daily ongoing memory. That's typically what's affected in the brain injuries.
So can I just ask, does it depend where you have the hit as to how your memory is? Like, there's certain parts of the brain that impact certain parts of your memory and your capacity to remember in the future.
Okay, for something like a stroke,
Yep.
it will depend on where and what vessel is affected. So which artery actually was the stroke in or which artery was affected, that will affect which part of the brain has the damage. For a traumatic brain injury, it doesn't really matter where the hit is. It can matter, that can add to it, but it's the actual trauma, the shaking, the actual hit. There's a little bit of this sounds terrible, but it's almost like if you think about the brain as like a bowl of jelly and you shake it, when it wobbles?
Yes.
So the brain, in a sense, is shaken in the skull, and that means that the damage can be pretty widespread. So there's widespread damage to axons, to the neurons, and in addition to that, if there's a hit in a particular place, then particular cells will also be damaged, and then it depends if it's the memory centre. So post-traumatic amnesia is a little bit different than long-term memory problems, which is much more about the area or the systems in the brain that are affected. Does that make sense?
It does. So I guess the next part of this is your number 4 is memory and dementia.
Which I think memory and dementia is a big one at the moment. You know, so many people are afraid that they're going to lose their memory, and that's like the number one fear with people aging. And, you know, it can be dementia, but most often I would say, you know, it's what we call worried well. And, you know, a lot of people worry about it because they've put their, you know, the keys in the freezer, or they've put the keys in the fridge instead of the milk, or they've, you know, done something like that. And that's almost a normal little slip. So there's a little slip where you almost have a lapse of attention and you end up just doing something that seems silly and you're like, oh, I'm losing my mind. Those things don't necessarily mean dementia. Dementia really is not just aging, not just busy. You know, you can do those sorts of slips because you didn't sleep well, because you had too much caffeine. You didn't have too much caffeine. Lapses in memory can be, you know, pretty normal for very busy people as well. If you think when you've got lots going on and you're thinking about something else, you know, if I'm not thinking about what I'm doing in the moment, it's really easy just to put the keys in the fridge instead of the milk, for example. But with dementia, it really is beyond that. So there's a consistency about it, and there's different types of dementia as well. So, you know, that word dementia is an umbrella term, and really the most common form of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. But there are other forms of dementia as well, so things like frontotemporal dementia. And when we talk about memory and dementia, sure, the episodic memory, the long-term memory, so learning new things and keeping them for later, that is what primarily the Alzheimer's disease, the typical form, that's what it is. That's the thing that becomes difficult and you lose. But the other form would be frontotemporal dementia. One form is a specific loss of semantic memory. So this is where people lose their knowledge about, like, what is a table, what is a duck, what is a horse, what is London. So they actually lose their general knowledge about the world, but in fact they function quite well on the whole for quite a long time in terms of everyday life. So I guess with dementia and memory, my first thing to say to people is just assume that it's not dementia first, and start to, in a sense, work on your brain health and work on your concentration and just be more aware of what you're doing, because it's probably just a bit of stress, also anxiety. All those things can actually impact memory.
Interestingly, I just spent the weekend with my uncle who has dementia, and at times I could see he was struggling how to remember to stand up, and yet he could tell us about his first motorbike when he was 17 and how it was constructed and put together, and his second motorbike, his third motorbike, and then struggled to work out how to stand up. So it's so fascinating about what stays and what goes.
Yeah, well, when the memories go, it's really the new learning. So if you think about it, it's what happened in the day, but then the memories when they go, it's the recent ones. They're not as consolidated. So we talk about consolidation in memory. Now, if you've had the childhood memories for a long time and it's something that you really enjoyed, like your uncle with his motorbike, then that's probably something he's been reconstructing over many decades as well. So the childhood memories tend to be the strongest as the dementia progresses. And the memories that go are the more recent. It's almost a temporal gradient. So you start with the present and they start to disappear from the present going backwards.
Yeah.
So the oldest ones are almost the ones that are protected.
Yeah. So interesting.
It is, and that's why it never fails to be fascinating about, you know, which part of memory. So that's quite strange when people say, you know, what I don't know what the duck is, or what do we do with that? So even not knowing what to do with a tool when, you know, they can't articulate, but if they're just going about their everyday life, they might actually use it appropriately, just not realise.
Yeah. All right, your number 5 is like the $1 million question. can we improve our memory, and is there anything we can do to kind of memory protect?
Well, I would say the first thing is attention. Where is your attention when you're doing something? You know, I think we've all driven somewhere and we get there, or walked somewhere and we get there and think, how did I get here? You know, and if it's a routine, so I go to work every day, then it becomes automatic, and I might actually be thinking of my shopping list. I might be thinking about picking up kids. I might be thinking about where I'm going next. So my mind is elsewhere. It's not there. And when I say my mind, I really mean attention. So attention is quite key. You know, the one thing we haven't talked about with memory is how does it get in and how does it get out? Well, to get information into your memory and in a sense, store it, you really need a few things. But the first is attention and focus on the information to be remembered. And then it's the encoding process might be about organising that information. You know, if I've got a filing cabinet behind me and I want something later, I don't throw it over my shoulder and hope it lands in and then go get it later. I actually need to organise it, and memories are a bit like that as well. How do they get in? So attention would be my number one. And I don't know whether it's an ageing phenomena that we just have divided attention. You know, it's a bit of a myth that people can multitask. Nobody can multitask. And I know people think women do this better than men. That is still a myth. It's really about switching your attention quickly. But you have to focus. And so for memory, if you're one of those people that's never had good attention, I would say in early life, midlife, before you notice any difficulties, I would say start training that. And that can be with mindfulness. It can be just with whatever is a focus. You know, for some people it may be jigsaw puzzles. Just whatever keeps your focus, you can train that a little bit. So that's my number one. Mm-hmm. And then things like using strategies. So some people have strategy to repeat information. Some people like to make up nicknames for people, or they call them Liz with the
red hair.
Yeah, exactly. So you can have a little system.
I was scared what she was going to say then.
Mackay Liz.
I did think about it.
Bogan Liz.
So people have little systems for how do you remember names? And that's maybe one of the number one complaints I get is can't remember the name of those people. And it's like, well, what were you thinking about when you met them? So A, attention, but B, come up with a little system. And, you know, obviously writing, you know, I look at the students these days and often they just sit and listen. So they're not actually, you don't know whether the information's really going in, but when you write notes or take notes, you actually process the information more. So that's partly to do with that encoding process. If you put in effort in the encoding, then it's going to be much more likely to be there later on, or you've actually retained the information. So getting it in and then getting it out, strategies.
So can I ask, I just read recently where it's saying handwriting a note is still better for memory encoding than typing it into a computer. Is that right?
Typing can be a bit of a motor skill. It can be automatic. So again, the danger with that is that your mind can go elsewhere because your fingers know the pattern. So yeah, I agree with that completely, because when you handwrite, you're having to think about the word, but translating that into the actual graphomotor sequence means that there's a little bit more effort. Now, memory doesn't always have to be effortful, but you know, in a sense, the emotion is a shortcut to the less effortful.
Yeah.
But when it's information and perhaps you're not as interested, so motivation helps.
Yep.
But what does motivation do? You know, if you think about it, motivation actually focuses your attention. You know, you're interested, so you engage more. I guess we can call it engagement. So if you're engaged with the content, then that helps the encoding, because in a sense you've almost alerted your sensory system to be ready to receive the information. I haven't really talked about the neurochemical processes, but obviously I'm talking, when I say alerting in the sensory system, it's neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are then engaged and active, in translating that information into the actual cellular processes.
Right. So I'm now about to have my memory tested by trying to succinctly summarise all of that wonderful information you gave us. Number one, what is memory? And I guess the big take-home memory for me around this is that our memory is based on a whole range of systems, and that it is much more than just short and long-term memory. We also have episodic memory, somatic memory, explicit memory, working memory, and it's much more than what you remember. It's like how you retain it, the coding that's around that. Number two is that memory and emotion are linked, so that their emotion heightens and intensifies what we remember. And so you talked about that memory is very complex in that we can have something like a flashbulb memory, which is really about when something worldwide has happened and everyone remembers where they were, and then it becomes a collective memory because it's influenced by what other people say. And where memory and emotion are linked are also in our reconstruction of memory. So you can have a family memory, a society memory, and that our memory is actually very plastic and gets reconstructed or recreated over time. Third, you spoke about memory and brain injury. And I think for me, the big take home here is that your memory can be impacted differently, whether or not it's a traumatic brain injury or whether it is from illness or stroke. And that people who've had any sort of brain injury can get post-traumatic amnesia, where their memory can be patchy for a short period of time or a long period of time, but we might never recover that ability to have that long-term autobiographical kind of memory. Number 4 was on memory and dementia. And you said, it's everybody's greatest fear that they may lose their memory or gain dementia as they age. However, most memory loss is just a lapse of attention or, it might be a slight process of aging. But you said the take-home message is for most of us, it's not dementia. It's not something to fear. It is simply that, we've had a lapse of attention or, we only be concerned about that if there's a consistency to that loss and it deteriorates over time. And number 5, we talked about, can you improve your memory? And you gave us a number of really powerful kind of tips. So the first thing you said is start with foundationally good lifestyle. Make sure you have good nutrition. Sleep is essential for good memory retention and protecting your memory and laying down your memory. Try and keep your stress levels to a low as much as possible because cortisol can shrink your hippocampus ability to retain information. So lifestyle is the foundation. And then on top of that, just pay attention. And I think in our busy world, this can be tricky to do. So we think it's a lapse or a problem with our memory, whereas in actual fact, we weren't focused in the first place. So number 1, have good attention. Number 2, have some systems for remembering things. So associations, colours, something that is really going to help you categorize it in your brain, just like if you were filing it in a filing cabinet. Number 3, writing notes helps encode. So if it's something that you want to remember, writing it down, and handwriting is better than typing it into phones or typing it on a computer, but it's, again, helping with the encoding. And number 4 is this motivation or interest helps you be engaged, which helps you focus, which I guess explains why some people remember TV shows like me and other people remember the periodic table. It's what captures your interest. How'd I go? How was my memory on that?
That was fantastic, actually. I was very impressed with that summary.
Look, I have loved today. Thank you so much for joining us today on 5 Things and teaching us all about the memory.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital 5 Things Nursing podcast acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nations owners of the lands we now tread. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. We recognise that these lands have always been places of healing, teaching and learning. We also wish to acknowledge the First Nations people of the lands of our global community and encourage our listeners to seek out, listen, and learn from the knowledge held in your shared space. As well as all major podcast outlets, you can find us at 5thingsnursing.podbean.com. Please also subscribe and give us a rating on your listening platform of choice. This helps others find the podcast. And finally, if you'd like to connect with Liz or myself on Twitter, we can be found at LizCrow2. And for me, it's inject_orange. We would absolutely love to hear your thoughts, ideas, or feedback. Thanks for listening to 5 Things